communities on the ground. So all of you, some of us, Harjeet said he's been fighting for this for 14 years, some of us a little bit less, but actually everybody, round of applause, everybody making this happen. Celebrate, let's celebrate it. Thank you, everyone. This is actually a very historic moment, and we have to celebrate it, but we also have to take a breath and keep fighting. Because the work continues, the work is not yet done, the work is not yet delivering for communities on the ground. And as we said, it is imperfect. We know that the funding announced meant much of it is not additional, and the numbers that have come through are a mere fraction of what is needed. And there is really so much still to be done to ensure it actually benefits communities on the ground, issues of governance and hosting, access and principles, and filling the fund with real climate finance. All of these issues still remain to be resolved. So we have a panel today to think about, what next when it comes to the Loss and Damage Fund, because we need to keep up the momentum. We can't just rest on our laurels. We can't just say we've won and go home and expect it to work. So the work continues here, and it starts today. So we have a wonderful panel. We have, to my right, Crisel, really, Mejillano from the Environmental Science for Social Change. Environmental Science for Social Change, which is a Jesuit research and training institute in the Philippines. She's going to give us an overview of what we can do to ensure that the Loss and Damage Fund really reaches communities and meets their needs. Harjeet Singh, many of you know, from CAN International, will then give us some insights on what does it mean that the Loss and Damage Fund is likely to be hosted by the World Bank? What are the questions of governance? What does that mean for access, etc.? And last but not least, Mariana Paoli from Christian Aid will take us into the questions of, what does it mean for financing and fair shares and these other questions that will continue to come up. My name is Teresa Anderson. I'm with ActionAid International, and I will pass on first to Christelle. Thank you.
Thank you, Teresa. Hello, test, okay. Thank you very much, Teresa. So I'll just hold the mic closer to my face. So good afternoon, everyone. It's an absolute pleasure to be speaking before you today and be in the presence of such a distinguished panel and audience. And I'm very deeply grateful for this opportunity to be able to speak. So first and foremost, in terms of, Teresa mentioned that most of us have been fighting for loss and damage our whole lives. Well, I haven't been fighting that much long, but I don't consider myself an expert on the issue, but our institution, ESSC, has first-hand experience in accompanying climate-vulnerable communities, so this is where I'll be speaking from today. I'll be sharing first about a specific community in the Philippines where loss and damage has become part of their reality, and this is to further deepen and contextualize why the newly set up Loss and Damage Fund needs to be directly accessed by vulnerable communities. So as you may all know, I'm pretty sure that the Philippines is highly vulnerable to climate disasters. Geographically, we have the Pacific Ocean to our east, which is also the largest climate determinant in the world, and that's where we get all of our weather, all of the typhoons. In the span of just 10 years, the Philippines has been hit hard with 2 Category 5 typhoons. We have Haiyan in 2013, and then we have Rai in 2021, and this happened when the COVID-19 pandemic was at its peak. So these typhoons, as I mentioned, since they come from the east, they move westward and they leave devastation in its wake. And many of the marginal settlements in the Philippines are located in geographically risky areas. So these are areas that are prone to landslides and storm surges. And of course, these people who live in the marginal settlements bear the brunt of its impacts. And I'll be sharing about this particular island. It's called Noknokan Island as one of these settlements. So just to give you a bit of insight on what Noknokan Island is, because I'm pretty sure it's pretty much under the radar when we talk about the climate, dialogue. So it's a tiny village of around 200 houses with a population of 2,000 people. So this island, it's actually situated on a sandbar in the margins of the Visayas region in the Philippines, and it's located approximately 18 kilometers from the municipality. And this community, for their livelihood, they rely on artisanal fishing, which they sell in the municipal market, and they have to travel over 18 kilometers to get there. So in the community, water security is actually a critical concern. The water that they use for consumption, they gather through rainwater catchments since they are unable to tap the groundwater sources as these have become salinated due to saltwater intrusion. So to put it bluntly and vividly, I'm sorry for this, but it's technically an informal settlement in the middle of the ocean, just to give you a better picture on what the community is like. So when Super Typhoon Rai hit in 2021, many of the houses and fishing boats in the community were destroyed, and they only had the church and the school as the evacuation sites. And it's been 2 years since then, and the community is still struggling to adapt and rebuild. And just to illustrate how deep this struggle is, when our team visited the island a few months ago and the community shared their struggles, they said, "We are here until we die." So this story of Noknokan Island is one of the countless shared realities, especially in the Global South. And this underscores how critical the Loss and Damage Fund is. So now that we reached that landmark agreement on day one of COP to operationalize the fund, how can we now ensure that the funds are directly accessed by vulnerable communities such as Noknokan Island? So just to echo a study recently published by SIDSE entitled Making the Loss and Damage Fund Accessible for Vulnerable Communities and Civil Society, recommendations based on experience with the Green Climate Fund. So keeping in mind the lessons learned from the GCF and drawing from the stories of climate vulnerable communities such as Noknokan Island, I hope to echo and share with you 7 learnings and recommendations for the operational mechanisms of the Loss and Damage Fund. So first and foremost, the LDF must effectively help people in emergency situations. The fund needs a priority focus on vulnerable communities. This means that the governance board of the fund should be represented by vulnerable communities and civil society organizations, humanitarian institutions, and faith-based organizations. Second, this fund needs to reach the most remote and highly vulnerable communities, even in areas where there is conflict. Humanitarian organizations and faith-based groups can be tapped to ensure the flexible delivery channels of this fund. Micro-grant windows for direct support to local communities also needs to be set up. Third, the fund support package must not be exclusive to government agencies. It needs to be directly accessible to subnational actors on the ground. Fourth, the fund needs to have a strong rapid response capacity, ensuring that making decisions on utilizing this prearranged support package are done within 24 hours, since climate change waits for no one. Fifth, the fund needs to be gender sensitive and responsive. As we know, women are disproportionately affected by loss and damage. So women also need to be represented in the governance of the board of the fund. And then sixth, vulnerable communities, or countries rather, need to develop national loss and damage mechanisms to ensure effective channeling of funding to vulnerable communities. And then the seventh point, which is also most important, the operationalization of the fund needs to be human rights centered. Loss and damage is a moral imperative and a justice concern, as we are dealing here with the survival of lives, livelihood, and cultures, which are all at stake. And these people have done the least to contribute to the climate crisis. So with these calls and recommendations, we believe that the new Loss and Damage Fund will be able to deliver in an effective and just way for climate-impacted communities. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Chriselle. And I would like to repeat the name of that report mentioned by Chriselle, Making the Loss and Damage Fund Accessible for Vulnerable Communities and Civil Society. That's been a really useful briefing by SIDSE. SIDSE's co-organized our event today. Chriselle is a member of SIDSE. And I think it will be useful if people want to look it up at taking forward onward discussions as the details of the hosting and the arrangements of the of the Loss and Damage Fund, particularly with the World Bank, move forward. So just want to flag that report for you. So next we're hearing from Harjeet Singh, who's been following climate negotiations and particularly loss and damage negotiations for many years. Harjeet, please tell us your thoughts about the hosting and governance arrangements at the Loss and Damage Fund and what we need to look out for. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you very much, Teresa, and thank you, Chriselle, for highlighting particularly the access part and putting communities right at the center. I want to go back to the point that Teresa raised earlier and saying we should all celebrate the achievement because we fought for it. I think, let me add one more line to that. Who is this we? Let's unpack that. It's civil society that led the fight. Governments did not have that kind of ambition until June 2022. Let us accept that. Civil society made it a litmus test in 2021. Please don't forget Glasgow. Glasgow was the time when all countries got together and demanded loss and damage finance facility. And then some of us got together. Of course, we were very involved and we made that happen. That's how the trigger. This afternoon, I was facilitating an event at for the Scottish government. And it was Scottish government that came forward, and that's how things changed. So let's not forget, of course, we have to celebrate what happened at Sharm el-Sheikh and now in Dubai, but the history started in Glasgow. That's where we made the first dent and got all countries together and made them realize that this is an important issue. Of course, then there were many factors got together, Pakistan floods, and all that helped in making sure that there's a political will, particularly from G77 and China and unity. I just wanted to get the history right and remind you, the role of civil society. Sometimes we underestimate what we can do. We think, oh, we are not negotiating, we don't have that much of power. This was an example of the kind of power we have if we are united, if we are strategic, if we are tactical, if we know, we can have a laser sharp focus on something, we are united, supporting each other, we can do it. So we should celebrate that. We should celebrate our success on what we actually did. But of course, as Teresa said, it's not enough. There are a number of gaps. Scale, there is no mention of scale. We are talking about hundreds of billions of dollars. And these are all also old studies, which say you need $290 to $580 billion annually for developing countries alone by 2030. The way temperatures have been rising, the kind of impacts we are seeing all around us, I'm sure this number is going to go up. And that's exactly the reason we are not putting a finger on a particular number, because it also depends on mitigation. It depends on how much support we are offering to communities and countries for adaptation. So let's not make the same mistake we did for $100 billion. We are bloody stuck with that number, which does not represent the reality. So let's not do it. And that also puts pressure on the entire system, and that's where GST conversation is important. So what we are missing in the text that we got agreed on the day one, let us try and plug that in the GST conversation, in the NCQG conversation, the new collective quantified goal. Capitalization, yes, the pledges that we have got so far are welcome, but they don't add up. And we need a capitalization plan. The replenishment cycle is 4 years. Impacts are increasing every year. How we are going to really connect that cycle with the replenishment cycle. So let's start looking at those details. And you know what we are realizing? That some of these pledges that have been made, of course, we know that they are not new and additional. But now you also started to see how some language is fluffy, some money is going to loss and damage funding arrangements. Insurance is beginning to pop up again, that they are going to support insurance, which we know is failing around the world. They have been selling insurance to developing countries. It's failing in developed world. Look at the US, California. We have seen how in the UK, when there were floods a couple of years ago, they said places are becoming uninsurable. So why are we putting money into a failed system or a failing system that's not going to work? We need capitalization in a manner that provides real money, and that's where we asked for grant, and that's what is going to be really helpful for communities and not what is being offered right now. And that is something that we need to continue to demand. And that's where, again, the ongoing conversations on global stocktake and the new collective quantified goal are the important aspects and something that we can do here also at COP28. Now, of course, we will try and get as much as we can in this process, but going forward, World Bank, which was a major bone of contention. Developed countries kept pushing for it, developing countries resisted, but eventually they agreed because developed countries said, it's a matter of speed. If you house it in an existing institution, we'll be able to provide money quickly. Okay, now the pledges have come and we need, of course, a lot more. Let's see how quickly money reaches people. So that's a test. And developed countries pushed while developing countries wanted to make it real, and they put certain conditions on the table. And those conditions were good. And again, we must also congratulate ourselves for working very closely with developing countries to make sure that World Bank now with getting this money and fund cannot just get away with whatever it has been doing for the last several decades. It has to now change its governance system. So the governance, the guidelines that have been developed, the instrument that has been put forth is going to be supreme. That is written in the document. So World Bank's policies are not going to be applied. Rather, the decisions taken by the Loss and Damage Fund Board are going to supersede, be it about selection of the executive director, be it about eligibility criteria, which was a massive fight on who is eligible. It's also about direct access. And that the point that Chriselle was making, which is so fundamental, and the one that another victory that we have, let me mention it here. We talked about community direct access window. We talked about that in May 2021, the paper that we wrote together, which was then Loss and Damage Finance Facility, why and how. Since then, we have been fighting for it, and I must mention, we got it. Read the language, it says communities are going to get money directly. Of course, those processes are going to be worked out. We wanted a specific window, but it is there firmly and strongly. Now it is our responsibility going forward to make sure that those policies and processes are such that make it easy for communities to directly access through their organization. And that's something that we should be working very closely with the Loss and Damage Fund Board. So even if World Bank is going to host, there are 3 exits that have been built in the system. 2 hard exits, 1 soft exit. In the next 6 months, World Bank has to confirm that all the policies related to access and eligibility, they are going to make those changes on. That's a commitment. And then by COP29, they have to do it in writing, show us that policies, that they have done it. And in both the situations, if they fail, the board is going to decide, Loss and Damage Fund Board is going to decide, you are out, you are going to get another host. It's very clear in the document, please read. And the third exit is around the performance. So after COP29, they're going to be given 3 years to then implement those policies. If they don't, then a performance review will happen and they're going to be chucked out. So it's an interim arrangement with some very robust conditions. And that's exactly the role of civil society, is to make sure that those conditions are met and we hold the World Bank system to account. Again, going forward, I'll be quick, Teresa. The important aspect is allocation of resources. I'm sure Mariana is going to talk a lot more about finance, but the allocation system is going to be developed by the board, which is important because we fought for eligibility for all developing countries, but we as civil society also recognize that it's small island states and least developed countries in the current context, and there are many other vulnerable countries who need support. And that eligibility criteria has to be, not eligibility, allocation criteria has to be detailed out. So the resource allocation system that's going to be worked upon is going to be important. If you were not engaged in this debate from the beginning, let me explain why we were not, or other developing countries were saying that we have to go beyond the definition of SIDS and LDCs. Small island states, no doubt, they're highly vulnerable and really facing the consequences. But LDCs, it's a dynamic list. Last month, Bhutan, from my region, is out of that list, just because the per capita income has increased slightly, but vulnerability has also increased. In November 2026, Bangladesh and Nepal, again, both the countries from my region, are going to be out of that list. In the next 20 years, you'll probably have 15, 20 countries left. So rich countries wanted to narrow their responsibilities by sticking to SIDS and LDCs. That's why we wanted to expand and say all countries are eligible, but of course we'll apply the equity formula to make sure that countries like Philippines and like Colombia, Guatemala, they all need support. So that's why. And another thing that we are going to be working upon is a trigger mechanism, how money is then transferred, and that's where, again, a lot of work is going to happen. We need scientific and research institutions to come forward and collaborate and make sure that we provide right kind of inputs. I'm going to leave you with 4 keywords, which you all should remember. And we have tried to make it very easy for you because they all start with A, access. We need to make sure that it is accessible to communities and countries. Additionality, whatever pledges we have got, whether they are additional to, so new and additional, to the existing finance that they are providing for climate as well as ODA. Adequacy, whether it's adequate for communities or not. You can't just provide whatever you can. No, that's not going to work. Whether it is helping communities adequately to recover from disasters and are able to then rebuild in a more resilient manner. And 4th, accountability. And accountability is not just about for contributors, but also for implementation. So we, sitting in the Global South, are also going to make sure that money is spent well. And the civil society pressure is important to make sure that it goes to the communities, for which it is intended. So these 4 words, and we actually did a sign-on statement and working with the humanitarian community where we elaborated those. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. So now we have a quick question. So the fund was established, and we started to see a few pledges moving forward. But what does it mean from a fair share point of view? Perhaps I just wanted to go back to some of the things, some of the principles from a climate finance lens of what we want to achieve here. So in terms of the loss and damage finance, what we have been talking about in terms of scale is something that really reflects the responsibility of the big polluters, the historical polluters, to really provide that foundation to fulfill their solidarity and really make those pledges based on the polluters pay principle. Now, one of the things that we have seen on and on in these negotiations is actually how climate finance has been repackaged, reallocated from adaptation, from ODA to actually to being filled in the loss and damage fund. So there is a big question here, which is essential, that loss and damage money is new and additional, and this is not what we are seeing so far. Also, a question on the quantum. How can we make sure that it's really needs-based, and going back to the 4 A's that Harjeet was mentioning, that's really adequate, but also predictable and based on a precautionary approach. There is one thing that I would like to center here, in our discussion on what a fair share of money means for the loss and damage fund, is the role of public money to fulfill that fund. We know how much all the initiatives of private finance, they have a limited role to play in relation to mitigation. They often neglect adaptation efforts, and we know they're completely inadequate to address loss and damage. So there are no profits to be found on loss and damage. So once and again, we really need to make sure that now that the fund is established, how can we really ensure that public finance at scale is made available, and it's grants-based, not more loans, thinking that already 57% of revenue of the least developing countries is already used to meet their debt payments. So with that in mind, it was back in May, Christianaid calculated what would be the fair share for the UK to pay for the loss and damage fund. And that would, the way we calculated this is looking at what what would be in terms of the fossil fuel phase-out equivalents on finance, and it would be between 12 to 15 billion pounds. Now, and one thing that we really presented and make the case on that report is actually new money is available through the forms of different taxation. For example, if we look at these different sources here that I'm mentioning on this table, you can stop fossil fuel subsidies, right, and redirect them to other sources. Wealth taxes, making the rich pay. The financial transaction taxes, climate damage taxes, fossil fuel producers, all those taxes based on polluters pay principle are really important. Last year, the revenue of some of the biggest fossil fuel companies, Shell, Total, etc., were about 200 billion US dollars. Actually, this would be kind of equivalent what would be a fair share of the G7 countries to put on this loss and damage fund. So, you know, it is possible. What we're missing here is really that political will to make it happen. Let's have a look at the pledges so far. What we have at the moment, and these are like NRDC figures, is about 655 US millions for the fund. Is that a start? Yes, absolutely. Is that new money? No, not necessarily. Is that all grant space? No, not necessarily either. So when you look at the scale that we're talking about, what we see here as just peanuts. And this is all voluntarily money that has been provided so far. So in the next 6 months and moving forward, we really have a big role to play and task to keep messaging, to keep working with the different negotiations, our governments, especially pressuring the Global North to fulfill their mandate, their historical responsibility, and provide the climate finance so much needed. And remembering also that without also further action on mitigation, phase out of fossil fuels, we are only going to see more and more less than damage. So we have a big fight ahead, and I just want to make sure that we'll be watching this fund really closely to make the case that it's based on fair shares. Thanks.
I would like to share apologies from one of our scheduled speakers. We were hoping that Ambassador Adao Suarez from the LDCs would be able to join us, but he's actually in the middle of negotiations on the Santiago Network for Loss and Damage. Many of you know that that's also a very fairly hot conversation, or has been anyway. So apologies from Ambassador Adao for not being able to join us here. We do always really enjoy having a government's perspective on all of this. But we'd like to throw, obviously, the room open. To those of you in the room. Any questions or even comments? We actually very much welcome comments, not just questions this time, because we think that there's some great insights from people in the room. So please share your views and share your questions. Yes, sir. Do we have a roving mic here? Yeah, thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is David Munene. I work with the Catholic Youth Network for Environmental Sustainability in Africa, SHINESA. I would like to thank all of you for organizing this very, very important side event in a space where I feel that loss and damage was agreed upon on the first day to sort of silence us and put the devil in the details. But I think it's still work in progress. Harjeet, thank you very much for your dedication to this since before COP27 and all. So I have just a couple of insights and then a question. Number one of the things that I was grappling with even before the Transition Committee number 5 met was the question of why World Bank? And why not Africa Development Bank, which is comprising of the countries that are also suffering from the same? Because on the other side of the divide, for example, my country is burdened with debt from World Bank. So I'm wondering whether it's possible for me to show a good face on the front and an ugly one on the back side. But it's just a question I'm grappling with, and maybe you can help disambiguate that. The second thing is, again, on the World Bank. Do we have key performance indicators? Because it says for 4 years, but I think for those who've been in the space for long enough, it's usually a testing of the water so that then the river can be built where it's not supposed to be. So maybe after 4 years, we will have, oh yeah, they performed very well. Because again, this depends highly on the board. And I look at the constitution of the board, I see 14 to 12. 14 to 12 because 12 from the developed world, right? Usually they tend to stick together from history in various other areas. The other 14 is debatable. And if a decision is going to be reached upon by voting and we require 4/5 of the board to sort of turn over a decision or something, how are we as civil society actors going to ensure that the board that is instituted is actually accountable, especially the 12 from the developed countries? I would like to rest there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, David. I'm sure you're triggering a lot of thoughts in people's heads already. So please, let's join a conversation about that. Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Zoha. I'm a researcher at the Stockholm Environment Institute. Nice to see everyone, familiar faces. I wanted to ask about civil society representation on the board of the fund. Following the TC process, I remember the earlier versions of the text, particularly the US proposal, had a proposal for 4 seats reserved for civil society. Then I think by TC3 it was watered down to 3, and then now there's no civil society representation on the board. And I wanted to understand which countries opposed it, because I couldn't attend some of the meetings, and whether it really came from developing countries that that civil societies were not going to be represented on the board, and if that is the case, why? What is the reasoning behind it, and how can we make sure that those most affected will still have decision-making power even if they are not represented on the board of the fund? Thanks.
I suspect that's a good start. Harjeet, would you like to respond to it?
You can come in on the World Bank later, or should I start with that? So, World Bank, absolutely. Right at the beginning when the suggestion was made that World Bank should become the host of the fund, we were all against, and exactly for the reasons you outlined. We know the history of the World Bank, the way it has caused inequality around the world, and the way it arm twists developing countries to change their policies, to make them more fit for multinational companies to come and invest there, and so that money eventually flows back to its shareholders. We know the game World Bank has been playing for a very long time, and Mariana can talk more to that. I think from a KPI perspective, again, some of those details are going to be worked upon next year. I think what we must appreciate the amount of work that was needed which happened in the last 9 months, starting from March. Imagine 5 TC meetings, 2 workshops, you are designing a fund. It wasn't easy. And it was not similar to Green Climate Fund, although we could have a lot of learning from the Green Climate Fund, but it is very different from the way that fund was conceptualized, and we have learned a lot from that. So I would say a lot more needs to happen between now and middle of next year, when the board is constituted and policies start getting drafted. Again, our role is extremely important, and I'll connect that with the next question on civil society. To hold the board accountable, I think we also need to make sure that there are right people on the board. And I'll be very honest in saying I'm very anxious who's going to be on the board. If again they are going to be simply negotiators, trust me, we will be stuck with the same situation as Green Climate Fund. Ideally, it should be a good combination of experts, and of course we need some negotiators because there is always politics involved. But we need people who understand it. In fact, some of us who supported developing countries wholeheartedly, but there were points when I was very insistent upon saying that we need to create a mechanism where the secretariat must be given some more power to do allocation of money. Because if on one hand you are saying speedy response, and you meet like a Green Climate Fund board, how can you ensure a speedy response? But there is so much of trust deficit that's there that developing countries were initially not agreeing to. And we then tried to convince them. And because they are negotiators, the reason I'm saying it, because they are negotiators. Imagine if they're really experts, they would say, actually it makes sense, let's create an allocation criteria, give the responsibility to the Secretariat. The moment a disaster happens, if that incident meets that criteria, transfer the money. At least the initial couple of $1 million should be transferred by the Secretariat itself. But one, of course, because it's housed in the World Bank, and then all the history, so they are not wrong. It's just that we need to go beyond if we really want this fund to perform very differently. So I think a lot of such things need to be think through afresh. I know we have a lot of baggage, but if we really want this fund to be efficient, we need to look at that and work with our developing country and also developed country partners. I was on a panel with Debbie from UK government, and the concerns were being raised on how money is going to be spent, and there were other parties and other conversations. We met the French minister. Remember, the French contribution is conditional. $100 million because they want to make sure that the governance is good enough. I mean, come on, you're going to be part of it to design. How can you put that conditions? That's exactly the reason we didn't want World Bank, and now you're putting another layer of conditions. So anyway, the point is, yes, there is some concern that money may not be spent well. That's why we need to have better accountability systems, as you were saying, to make sure that board is accountable, the Secretariat is accountable, and eventually money reaches. Now, on your question, Zoha, on US, whenever US, and I'm going to make that statement, whenever US says that it believes in civil society participation, never trust. Whenever US says that, oh, it's all for human rights, never trust. We know what US does when it comes to human rights. We know what US does in the name of civil society. You know what the package was? They were saying members from the philanthropic community to be on the board. So they wanted to give seats to the contributors. And who are going to be the contributors from the global north? So the balance that you are seeing would have been very different. Because if you have 4 contributors sitting on the board, and when you say, what their point was, if you want to be on the board, become a contributor. I mean, come on, it's your responsibility to contribute. So that was the game. Also, when they say civil society, it was private sector. So developing countries, and I can tell you, majority of developing countries wanted civil society to be on the board and with voting power. We were also saying, although we were a bit hesitant, and I'll be very frank, because voting power, especially when money is being transferred, you need to have a lot of robust systems within our own civil society, because then that person who sits on the board becomes really powerful, and all kinds of influences can come. We are all human beings. So are we ready for that? I think that was the question. But of course, we did say, fine, we will go for the voting power. But when the proposition was with private sector involved, the developing countries said we can't. So the reason we got excluded from the board with voting power was because private sector was there. How can you give private sector that voting power and to be on the board? That's why. So you have 2 solid paragraphs in the text on civil society participation in terms of creating processes and mechanisms. Now we have to claim that space so that we are really, and in fact, when you speak to any negotiator, any transitional committee member, the first sentence they say when it comes to loss and damage fund, they recognize the role of civil society, both developed and developing countries. So they know the role we played, because nobody knew how this fund is going to be designed. They all were looking for answers, and we were also providing inputs. You were involved. SEI has been providing all the inputs in terms of governance. So we all came together and provide that, and I think that spirit has to continue. Sorry for the long response.
If I could just add a few reflections on the challenges that we have ahead with the World Bank. First of all, it's an institution that, since the Paris Agreement was agreed, it already releases about $15 billion for climate finance, for fossil fuels expansion. And yet, that same bank is hosting this loss and damage fund. The challenges on government that Harjeet has already mentioned, yes, we do have a chance to, in theory, have a more balanced representation of Southern voices on the board vis-a-vis what the World Bank is, which is essentially Northern dominated, is still the decision-making and accountability there will be key. But the approaches on how the money, how funding is capitalized, when you look at all the efforts that the World Bank has been doing, for example, with the cascade effect, the narrative from the billions to trillions, and really now doing this, what is called the second evolution roadmap, which tries to create the enabling environments, how to de-risk, how to make private sector first approaches, private finance and financialization really as the golden solution to really capitalize the bank to provide a lot more climate finance. And the way they disperse that, again, is with a number of conditionalities for those enabling environments and the rest of it. So how can we secure that the money that will sit in this loss and damage fund will really respect the conditionalities, the conditions that were established here at COP? This is something really critical for the next 6 months and beyond. And I really hope that in 6 months down the line, we can find concrete ways to measure to what extent the World Bank will not continue to deliver or thinking that we'll deliver as business as usual, rather we'll really implement the conditions that were set here. I think that's one of the biggest challenges ahead.
And I will actually use my prerogative as well to pitch into this conversation. Mariana really touches on the way that the World Bank, theory of change has been about de-risking. We've seen how across these negotiations, so much of this tension between the conversation about public finance and private finance is really causing a lot of conflict around how climate finance is being defined and distributed, and what its real impact is on the ground. And part of the problem is that we see increasingly governments, often through agencies like the World Bank, are using public finance to essentially subsidize private finance institutions and then saying, oh, we're leveraging more finance, but that finance is loans, essentially. So even those little available public finances are still being transformed into loans, and communities on the ground aren't even getting the grants. And, we've seen the World Bank do this. We've seen across climate negotiations, this kind of strategy being used to define climate finance. And of course, our fear is that the World Bank will do exactly the same with the Loss and Damage Fund, and we have to avoid that happening. Another thing that I want to flag caution about, and Harjeet did briefly touch on, is the lessons from insurance, right? We've seen a lot of discussion about how insurance systems like the Global Shield could be seen as a strategy for addressing loss and damage. Of course, private insurance companies are positioning themselves as the ones to absorb, whatever public funds there are, and again, profit off disasters and theoretically distribute funds to communities. But we know they're private companies, so of course it's in their interest to do what insurance companies always do, which is to say, well, you don't quite meet the conditions for the payout. And we've seen that happen actually in several instances of climate risk insurance, where especially parametric triggers are used, where parameters of what is defined as a disaster to get the money payout. This particular disaster or that particular disaster wasn't defined in the small print, so you don't get the payout. So we need to be really cautious about treating insurance in that way. And we need to learn the lessons when we apply this, this trigger mechanism in the loss and damage fund, that we don't make the same mistakes that the insurance companies do when we define triggers too narrowly. So, so a lot of lessons still to be learned. I'm really happy to see a lot of nodding, and we need to make sure that this really does work for communities. Chriselle, do you want to contribute anything, or
So
can
it's more
open
of
the
a-
conversation a bit more?
Thank you very much. So the insights of the panel have been very, such a huge learning experience for me as well. So I guess this is more of just my own thoughts and questions. So what is clear with the World Bank being the host of this fund, that, to put it frankly, it's very problematic. And we really see that there needs to be a reform in terms of the funding architecture of how these banks are structured. So it's just more of a thought, because this has been already emphasized by Miyamoto. So how can exactly we as civil society form a cohesive voice in calling for this reform? Is there any way we can do that? Is there a practical way forward? Since, as Harjeet mentioned, that civil society played a huge role in getting the loss and damage fund agenda during Glasgow. So I'm just wondering if there are any pathways that we can explore as civil society to call for this reform, since if this doesn't change, we'll be just stuck in a loop. So yeah, it's just a question for everyone. And yeah, thank you.
And thank you, Chriselle, and I'll come back to you later, Harjeet. But and I want to add to Chriselle's question, because we're pitching questions back now to all of you. So get ready. You know, if you've got an answer to Chriselle's question, and I have a complementary question, which is, those of you in the room, you know, are you activists? Are you academics? Are you scientists? Are you governments? How do you see your role taking it forward? So give us your thoughts, please, on these questions. Yeah, we'd love to hear. Thank you.
So I guess I have three things. First, a reflection that I've been thinking about a lot is something that my friend told me, actually. The U.S. pledge to the Loss and Damage Fund is obviously $17.5 million. I'm Jonathan Kim. I'm from Indiana University. I'm a graduate student there. Indiana University just paid our coach $15 million to fire him. Not even to do anything, just to fire him. So that's been something that's been swinging around in my mind a lot, and it just sort of puts to scale the contribution the U.S. believes it's making. So that's one thing. To your question, Teresa, I'm a graduate student. I study how politics constrains policy instrument choice and design. So the way I see my role is, figuring out the avenues that are most effective in changing how policymakers make decisions, and using that research to enable activists, right, to seek out these best pathways forward. And my question is sort of building off Mariana's, Chriselle's, Harjeet, you mentioned using the GST as an avenue to strengthen the Loss and Damage Fund. I'm wondering if you can explain a little bit more what that looks like. What are you envisioning? What role does that play in the L&D fund?
Thank you. And yeah, thank you for that shocking number about, the coach being fired for 15 million. My personal favorite number is Beyonce's new house cost 88 million. Yeah, so if we could get a couple Beyonce houses in the mix, that would be useful. Please. No, we can have a mic.
I'm Lisa Sullivan with Mary Knoll. We were one of the shadow sponsors from afar. We don't have the expertise. We do see this such as an issue of climate justice, and so we need that expertise. I sit in a desk 10 blocks from the World Bank. I also had a lot of dialogue with Christina Chan of the Transitional Committee. She was very open to listening to faith groups. So we have that dialogue, we have that proximity to the World Bank, but we don't have the expertise. And so we need those connections to share with our large faith networks that I think can have a large role in making sure this fund is what it needs to be. So thank you for that expertise, and we just need to keep those channels going.
Okay. There's one behind you.
So thank you so much. My name is Sheila. I'm so glad that quite a lot has been spoken. And for me, it was a reflection on, first and foremost, I was hoping to hear if there is any intentionally or internationally agreed definition on loss and damage under the convention. Why? It might look very weird, but then I'm suspicious that it will also be defined like any of those funds, the adaptation fund, or it will be misconstrued as humanitarian financing. So is that something that we have all understood, and is it something that we've all defined under the framework, such that when we get back to, we are apparently doing a national adaptation plans, so that this confusion is not taken in there, and then the people that are supposed to be the right targets for the fund miss out simply because of a definition. Yeah. That is one. The other is that I am thinking that as members of civil society, that when we had this last year at Sharm el-Sheikh, I was also hoping that we internally or at national level would do advocacy or studies on our readiness to access the loss and damage fund as countries, so that what do we bring to the COP28 is the factual data that shows and says, wait a minute, even if you people are negotiating, this is what we have found out. We took a bold step as Uganda, and we did a study on Uganda's readiness on the loss and damage fund. Can I shock you? We are only 11% ready. And so what do I take away from here? That we have a problem with institutions, we have a problem with capacity, we have a problem with governance, and now we are releasing funds, and we are not even yet about to correct the systemic challenges of the GCF, of the GEF, and now the loss and damage fund. And the question is, are we just here? Is it rhetoric? Are we really speaking about the climate realities of the last mile person on that flashboard? Because if we have weak systems, and we have a whole report that shows that we have weak systems, that our institutions are not yet prepared, that we have policy frameworks that are overlapping, we don't know who has the mandate to host the fund in country, and then we come and say that, fine, let's go full blast. We also did a technical note on how to measure, verify, and report loss and damage fund. Is that something that has been talked about? Unfortunately, we were not here on the first day, and so we are not sure if the MVR technical report was also presented during the negotiation, such that we're able to track not just commitments, but performance. And so, something that looks like, can we create a feminist fund, if you allow me to use the word? Because then it would be transformative, it would ensure a just transition, it would ensure equity, and by the way, it would also address the human rights issues, governance in that fund. So can we make this fund much more better than the previous fund? So as civil society who are seated here, before we come from the demand end, what have we done to the supply end to ensure that we have reports, we have studies that will individually in our countries demonstrate as to whether we are ready? So that when we come to these pavilions, we speak with a lot of confidence and say, yes, whereas we are ready, but we have a weakness in our systems, we have a weakness in A, B, C, D. So does that form the criterion for which you are eligible to access? So who defines the eligibility criteria for accessibility of this fund? Who defines it? Is it the person with the money? Certainly, if the person with the money defines it, then we shall all be locked out. I submit. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I was also just hoping, I was also hoping that we would have somebody probably from the communities also sit at the panel so that they give us the realities of loss and damage. Thank you. Microphone, otherwise I'll continue speaking because this is a very...
Okay, we're going to go with Harjeet next. We're going to have the panel respond, and then we can have new questions.
Okay, Okay, let me probably start with the last one. So thank you very much for raising those issues. And coming from Global South, we have to be very vocal about it. You know, there are major gaps, and thank you for highlighting. And we have to shift gears, and that's the point. And that's why this event very aptly named What Next? And we have to talk about, after now getting this decision, what is our role? And that's why, you know, Teresa asked, we come from different, you know, parts of the society. We have different roles to play, and we need all hands on deck approach. We all have to contribute. Nobody has all the answers. So what exactly do we have to do to make sure that this fund is real and actually make sure that it respects human rights, it has a feminist approach, and making sure that it is accountable to people. And for that, we have to go back and do a lot of work back home in our own countries. They are not ready. In fact, I'm remembering Salim, who I worked very closely with, shoulder to shoulder, fighting for this fund. He himself was trying hard to have a national mechanism on loss and damage for a very long time. And imagine in Bangladesh also, it wasn't easy. So our governments also have to step up in the developing world to make sure. And that's why we should not be hesitant. Next year, when we are going to work on the allocation framework as well as some of the accountability mechanisms, we should make sure that those principles are very strong and robust, so that when money reaches governments, they are spending it properly. We fought with them, we fought for them to make sure, and we know that a lot of money needs to go to governments, because infrastructural reconstruction is something that communities cannot do, right? That's the reason we also fought for community access window, so that they can also directly access, while government should also involve communities. So absolutely, there's a lot of work that we need to do, and the definition of loss and damage can also be dealt with the allocation framework. Since I've been involved in this area, so the reason it was not agreed because of the liability. I think we've crossed that line. We have now reached a point where we've got this fund, and even US has come on board. I think allocation framework gives us an opportunity to agree to the definition, if not the formal definition, at least the elements that will determine who gets the resource. So I think that is very much possible. I also wanted to build on what Teresa was saying on insurance, and I would rather point a question to Teresa, because she has done a lot of work on social protection, and which connects to the previous point. We have those solutions. And if Teresa can outline and share what those solutions are, those solutions need to be funded. We don't have to innovate and come up with new solutions on ground. There are many solutions which can respond to loss and damage at the country level. This money should fund those solutions. Than now saying, because we have got money, now you create new solutions. Solutions are there. Developing countries have been trying. Communities have been responding. They have, what they lack is resources. So again, Teresa will outline that. That's a request, Teresa. It's a reverse, role reversal. On innovative sources, I want to also talk about this kind of landmine, rather. Bad analogy in these times. But the reality is, we as civil society talked about innovative finance for a very long time. We were initially talking about adaptation, mitigation, and now eventually, when we got a decision, it's linked much more with loss and damage. We are talking about shifting fossil fuel subsidies, putting a levy on fossil fuel extraction and financial transaction tax. And again, Mariana did talk about it. I think the important thing is to recognize the politics around it. And when developed countries pick something up, an idea like this, we really get nervous. They now want to talk about innovative sources a lot more than us. What does that mean? That's something that we have to really watch out. And for us, public finance has to be the main source, and you highlighted that part. And the reason I'm saying is from a very recent example. With full credit to France, France did try to actually persuade IMO to start looking at levy on shipping so that some money can be diverted for loss and damage. And I could see and hear Jean-Christophe talking about it just before the Paris, this financial summit. And then at the summit, there was commitment being made that yes, we are going to be doing it. Then we reached London meeting in July of IMO. What IMO said? We are not ready. We will think about it. And even if we raise money, we will be actually using that money to green our sector. That's exactly the reason we said loss and damage fund has to be paramount and not funding arrangements, because funding arrangements are beyond our control, right? So what IMO is doing, what IKO is going to do, what other financial institutions are going to do in terms of putting levy or not, is beyond our control. So that always needs to be complementary, not the main source of funding. While it's a good source because it ensures automaticity which is needed to fill the fund, then you're not depending on pledges. But that nuance has to be understood. There's a give and take involved there, and there's a risk involved. So that's why we need to really understand that part. And I look to you, Teresa, on social protection.
Well, maybe I can come to that, but Mariana?
Just two quick reflections here. The first one is just because some of the institutions in the Global South might not be ready or as ready as they should to really provide how the accessibility of the funds, on how the accountability, etc., should not be used as an excuse that the way that the funds are dispersed are solely controlled and decided by northern-based institutions. So we have to bear in mind how that is used in terms of how the developments of the funds are established. My second point is actually maybe linked with something that Krista was mentioning in terms of the reform that has been said and was present on Mia Motley Bridgetown Initiative and all of the rest of it. I think there are two kinds of reforms that we are talking about. Yes, we all agree that multilateral development banks and international financial institutions are not fit for purpose to develop to deliver the climate finance and development finance that we need. But it's not that they need more money to keep implementing the neoliberal ways, more debt, and the rest of it, the ways that they have been doing. What we're talking here is about a reform that actually provide more finance, debt-free finance, without conditionalities, the kind of reform that really addresses tax evasion, tax avoidance, illicit financial flows, and that can actually create the frameworks for proper taxation for this kind of new innovative sources of finance. So maybe innovative sources is such a big word that could be, it's kind of being used both to attract the kind of, the private finance or financialization that we see the likes of the World Bank promoting, etc., as well as to address some actually of the new ways to, through taxation, that we need to get the public money that we need for climate finance. So we have to make a distinction about what kind of reform that we really need.
Teresa, I did not respond to the GST question.
Yeah.
So GST and loss and damage. So we do have very specific proposals on that. So first, we want to see the scale being mentioned, as it is not mentioned in that. So there's a language. In fact, I would request you to pick up today's ECO if you have not. So we have written actually 6 points in that ECO, and that's exactly what I'm referring to when I speak. And yesterday we worked upon it. So first, scale. We need to make sure that we talk about hundreds of billions of dollars, which is not really getting reflected, so that range is not talked about. And then who's going to provide that money? Of course, the role of rich countries to do that. Also mentioning a sub-goal, which is now connected to NCQG. That sub-goal on loss and damage is extremely important. Then debt relief, something that Mariana, you referred to, how we link that with debt relief. And again, in this conversation, we've already started talking about it. Fourth, human rights. Again, we got a very weak language on human rights only in the preamble, so GST has to make sure that it is strengthened. Fifth, we talked about economic and non-economic losses and damages, the necessary support required. That language has to be strengthened. And finally, the continuum of we have to talk about, if we continue burning fossil fuels, if we don't provide enough money for adaptation, then we will be suffering the consequences much more. And by the way, the current text that came out at 5 a.m. this morning does at least have this particular reference very strongly. So if you start evaluating the current text against these 6 points, pick up the eco, then you'll be able to really check where the gaps are, so that in the next few days, we advocate for the inclusion of that text so that we actually get a robust outcome. So the gaps that are there in the current text and loss and damage can then be bridged through this process. Thank you.
So just a comment, a response, since our audience from earlier asked about the community level experience and the loss and damage. So I just was reflecting, since in the Philippines, and I might be opening a can of worms when I say this, but in the Philippines, we have this, what we call the People's Survivals Fund. So it's an annual allocation of 100 billion pesos from the national budget that funds, that streamlines finance to support adaptation projects of climate vulnerable communities. But now, as I'm just going back to the requirements of this fund and looking at how exactly can communities access it, there are only 4 requirements, but highly technical. The community needs to prepare a letter of intent. They have to prepare the land use plan of their municipality, the investment plan. So how can you actually expect communities to be able to deal with this, bureaucracy of the process? And they're already suffering the impacts of, loss and damage. So this is just something to think about, and just to bring that point across, that we really do need a civil society to start at home.
Thank you. And yeah, that's absolutely one of the key messages that you introduced earlier, that, the example you give is a clear reason why we've been demanding direct access and communities' ability to realistically ask for that money in the design of the fund, so that communities can access it without having unrealistic paperwork or institutional demands. And certainly communities themselves play a really key role in holding accountability or ensuring accountability for the distribution of money when it comes to national level. And I think we'd all love to see a lot more requirements for community participation as funds are distributed, because we know that that is one of the key ways to ensure transparency. Harjeet did ask me a question about social protection, and I hope it's okay that I bring this up, because it is something that we haven't had the chance to talk about recently, as we've been so focused on the fund structure. But as we look forward, what are we going to spend the money on? And thank you for the comment about, institutions, readiness. I think social protection is actually something that we could bring in without too much difficulty. So, we know that when climate disasters happen, communities face a loss of income from crop losses. They face the costs of rebuilding. They're unable to afford planting for the next season if they've lost everything, right? So then the spiral continues. They get pushed deeper and deeper into a poverty spiral when a disaster happens. It's the people who don't have deep pockets who are most vulnerable. Social protection is a really key way of helping people stop falling deeper into that poverty spiral. Many people don't actually know what social protection is, but probably everyone in this room has benefited from social protection in some way. Social protection is something like sick leave, maternity leave, or it can be, parental leave, furlough pay during, pensions, exactly. During COVID, there was the furlough leave scheme in many countries. That's a form of social protection. Housing support, free school meals. These are all forms of social protection. So when a disaster happens, we can apply social protection to help protect communities from falling deeper into poverty. Now, to the question, is there coordination and overlap between humanitarian and loss and damage money? Yeah, theoretically, humanitarian response happens in the initial 6 months, sometimes a year after a disaster, the initial response, the initial saving lives. And loss and damage, to simplify, is the longer term rebuilding and recovery efforts. But there can be overlap, and sometimes that's not necessarily a bad thing if it's what's needed. If it's called humanitarian, if it's called loss and damage, if it's still helping, that's still fine, right? And if we apply it to to climate disaster context, you can have where communities lose their crops, for example, they can get income support. Where communities' homes are damaged, you know, they can get the one-off payments to rebuild their homes and avoid going deeper into debt. Where they lose their livelihoods altogether because of rising sea levels or desertification, they can have training and you know, new kind of job opportunities built in. There can be all sorts of schemes that can really help communities bridge these disasters. So social protection, in addition to the money for rebuilding hospitals and schools and roads, etc., social protection has to be a key part of our loss and damage thinking. And as we move forward, we'd like to see more governments making proposals for social protection to be part of their strategies. And certainly these are issues and recommendations that are coming through on the task force, the various Warsaw International Mechanism task forces. Okay, I think let's take one. Are there any more burning questions or contributions? I think we've had a really rich discussion. I think this has been an amazing audience. Okay, Harjeet, as usual. Sorry, mate.
You have put such a title, Teresa, what next? And that is such an open-ended thing, right? Yeah. So, and I got reminded of something. In fact, you are the trigger in this case. Because when you talked about social protection and you talked about biodiversity, that was the trigger. So what happened in these TC conversations, Transnational Committee meetings? Of course, there was no time. The focus was much more to design the fund and work on the governing instrument. But one issue that came up very clearly was there was a knowledge gap in terms of what needs to happen on the non-economic losses and damages. And because when we just talk about fund, and as Teresa, as you said, this year and last year focus was too much on the fund, so we didn't get to spend time on the granularities on what needs to happen and what the impacts are, and as somebody said, talking to communities what they are facing. When we talk to community, we realize that, you know, there's a clear loss of language, loss of culture, there's displacement, migration, and by the way, displacement, migration language is there in the fund. Again, this is the first time we have such strong language on mobility, so that's something that gives us a good hook to now work on. So loss of language, culture, biodiversity, and mental health, for example. Some of these issues are categorized as non-economic losses and damages, but they need financial measures. Let's not assume just because we are saying non-economic, you know, there's no finance conversation related to that. So we need to generate a lot of awareness and do some research and make that connection. And one example I can give from my own experience of working in the humanitarian sector, mental health. After every disaster, we see psychosocial care being so important. And to provide psychosocial care, you need to invest in mental health systems. That's money is needed to strengthen public health and then response systems. So it's not that psychosocial care, just because it's non-economic loss, you don't need money. You actually need a lot of money. Biodiversity restoration, you need money for that. So I think it's also important. The reason I'm saying, because I also see research community sitting here, the transitional committee asked for that information. So now the board, because the mandate is going to be shifting to the board. Board will need all that information. Resource allocation framework must also talk about non-economic losses and damages. That's why I'm particularly highlighting these areas, that when we provide our inputs and there are knowledge gaps, let's also mention those things so that board is very well informed and the allocation framework has ideas like social protection, what needs to be funded, right? Where the gaps are. So that's why I'm highlighting. Sorry.
Thank you. Right. I think this has been really actually an enjoyable discussion, thanks to all of you. And I would like to ask the panel to do a 2-minute wrap-up. Chriselle, would you like to kick us off? Then Mariana and Harjeet?
Can we start with Mariana?
Okay, are you ready, Mariana?
Sure. So,
No. 1 minute for you, Harjeet.
I guess I just wanted to come back to, you know, in answering the what's next question. For me, one of the main reflections that we have to keep advocating for and campaigning is really on the make polluters pay principle and ways that governments can push that agenda forward, especially in the global north, to fulfill their historical responsibilities to fill this fund. So as we discussed here, there are ways they can do it through different forms of taxation. What we need is political will. So within all these negotiations, with public finance being so central, I guess this is one of the biggest challenges that we have. So it's not just, COPs are the big moment to try to get progress on that agenda, but in between, I think, especially now that the fund has been established, we have this really big task ahead. Thanks.
So thank you to my co-panelists. It has been such a rich learning experience for me, especially as someone that has just been coming into this whole loss and damage discourse. So I guess what I can say with the wrap-up, I just want to reiterate what Harjeet said about the non-economic losses and damage, since as the arrangements of this fund continues to be further polished, we always need to remember to put the human face in terms of loss and damage and the non-economic losses, because when you quantify and put a value on these non-economic losses, so cultures, families, lives lost, it kind of strips away the value of it. So yeah, that's just, I am sorry, I'm ending on a rhetoric. So let's just see how this whole discussion plays out. We have several days left at COP. A lot more can happen, but all the more important to stay engaged, especially starting at the national level. So thank you very much.
Do you really want me to? Okay. I'll go back to the point which with which I started my intervention. We are entering a different phase. But some of the experiences that we had in terms of we working as civil society, recognizing our own power and the way we collaborated, I think we have some kind of a template that we used over the last 2-3 years to bring about this change, which is have a very ambitious target, a super sharp strategy, clear tactics. We engaged with everybody, and many of you are sitting in this room. You talk about UN system, the research community, the faith community, indigenous people, young people, negotiators, not only with developing countries, also with developed world. We just talked to everybody. Media played such an important role. And we need to continue with that spirit and engagement. This is a big thing. Nobody has all the solutions. And we need to work in that collaborative mode, but also realize the power that we bring in. Governments are still not ambitious enough. They still have this 5-year cycle or whatever election cycle you have in each country. They are stuck with that. We need to hold them to account, be it developing countries, because we always take sides of people. We always want to represent their interest, right? That's the effort we are at, or that's the commitment we have made to ourselves. So we need to hold our governments to account, and even this system, which has been so easy going, and here climate crisis is happening. And look at how we have really shaken up this system, that even the executive secretary talks about loss and damage, which was not the case 2 years ago, right? So let us realize our power. I think we can do it. We have demonstrated that very recently. Thank you.
Thank you. Right. So yeah, I want to wrap up on a similar note, just recognizing all of you in this room that have been fighting and have made us get this win that we got to celebrate a few days ago. Thank you to all of you. I hope that what you've heard here today from each other and the panel has inspired you to keep going, informed you on what to do, and let's keep the energy and the momentum up together. Really, it's going to be an exciting new phase. Let's do it, everyone. Thank you.
Were you tweeting as well about the event? No,
Amazing, really. Oh, thank you. I really loved you. You were so clear, but I think you made it go, wow, we can really work together. It's a genuine invitation. Yeah. Let's formalize this. Let's formalize how we work. Let's make something happen. Thank you.